And good evening. It's July 23rd, 2024. We're on our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. It's a series from the Bible Project, and it's about the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in that Outside the Class section, we have these TaNaK Old Testament source video sections set up for your review. Because our intention with Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. They would be found in that source video playlist. We're going to try to keep these to about 15 minutes or so. We want to make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we're on a quest. Scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you do think that these might be useful to others, then that is when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, we're going to be covering the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament, and yet we're going to be doing it in the original order of the collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So it could get really interesting once we get past these first 5. Remember, these videos that we'll be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend. They can all be found on the Bible Project website, and of course in our source video playlist. Because as we're in this series, I want us to remember there's probably going to be more questions than we have answers. We will try to respond to some of the information, and as we discuss it, I'm just going to leave it up to you if you think it's an answer. But there will be a lot of questions. We're going to be asking a bunch about all kinds of things of which we're probably not going to know. It is what it is. Though the TaNaK, the Old Testament, Genesis, Bereshit, right? We're in chapters 12 through 50. This is our part 3. So, the Lot solution. It's not the answer. We get it. I really do understand why Abram would have gone that direction, why it was his number one choice. Abram goes to his second solution, since he still has a barren wife. So he's a child with Hagar, his wife's maidservant. This servant is most likely received as a gift from Pharaoh after he tried to save his own skin by passing Sarai off as his sister. Did not go well for Pharaoh, and Abram left with more than he arrived with. But Pharaoh, he wasn't taking any chances. So in that exchange, he acquires Hagar, this Egyptian maid servant for Sarai. This is the servant that Ishmael comes from. Solution number 2. Sarai has a fit of jealousy and demands that Abram send her and the child packing. It's not one of his best moments. You know, this actually happens twice in their lives. Once when the boy was an infant, and the second after Isaac, that intended heir, is born. He gets sent away again. This is such a messy story, and it can happen when we try to help God along sometimes. You know, we might think we view it as a test. I tend to lean towards consequence of choice. And in this, there are innocent people involved. Hagar and Ishmael are innocent. They are just a consequence. And God? Well, let's just say that our God is a just God, a merciful God, a blessing bestowed upon Ishmael and his lineage. Well, take a read. I think you might be a bit surprised. Because I think most folks don't take the time to really look at the blessing and promises that his lineage receives for generations. One could argue, still to this day. It's such a reassuring thing that God will make it right in this life or the next, even with our messy involvement in things. So this is one of those interesting covenant commitment pieces. And what I mean by that is we have a promise before this, right? But it seems that Abram might not be getting the full picture of God's involvement. So God approaches Abram, reiterates the promise, and he puts in what one would say it reinforces the promise with a covenant commitment, a clarity that the son will come from him and Sarai. Name changes for both, now Abraham, and Sarah, and a son called Isaac. It's interesting that as we keep seeing through this entire story, from Abraham to us, mind you, I think it's one of the more endearing points, one of the points that we take to heart, one of the points that we rely on most deeply, is that God stays. God sticks with us. We've seen it prior to this, and now we're seeing it with Abraham and with his part of the story. Because even if Abraham, who I believe tries with good intent to help, and he messes stuff up, that God even has to fix things, but he stays the course. Abraham will be a father to not just one nation, but many. One will be set apart. One will be chosen to be a priestly nation. One to be special representatives of God to the rest of humanity. You know, at times, I really do ask, who are we in the picture? Are we possibly taking a role that's maybe not ours? That's food for thought. Bless the nations. Yes, but also you're going to be part of the nations. You know, we know from experience God's blessings, especially looking back, sometimes they're bigger than we even expect. I do see the struggle with this because it's interesting that when we see the whole story, and there's a lot more going on that at times we see or that, truthfully, we're even taught about. God can appear on both sides of an issue. And sometimes I think that can bother us. We tend to have narrow views of things at times, and we might miss that God blesses both sides of an issue. I think already that comes with paradigm challenges that I even mentioned the word sides. How about two parties are introduced? They're part of the story. With the fallout, now, millenniums later, does make it interesting. Back to Abraham and back to Isaac, right? The son that is going to be the one that the nation of Israel will eventually come from. Because that is that set apart nation to be the example to the other nations, to be the priestly nation. And that means serve. I think we think often that we're looking for the power role, that we're looking for who's going to be in charge. But the priestly side, they never were in charge. Well, they're not supposed to be. I mean, way down many hundreds of years later, we get to Jesus, where we get to Yeshua, and we see things not as they should have been. We're going to leave that for another story. But Isaac, he has two sons. Sloppy, deceitful story there. And from there, we also see Jacob gets the line. Now, when we hear this in Scripture a lot at times, in this example, it's somebody's name, right, that we're told, almost as a postscript, that their name means something. I'm not totally convinced that when we see people's names in Scripture, and then they tell us what the name means, that it meant that before them. I mean, especially early in the game. I can see later, but not early. I'm more compelled that it became known that, because we see the character that follows, and that character is going to define for us with their behavior. So we have Jacob, and they're saying his name means deceiver. Now, as we go through the story, we see that Jacob is very much wrapped around the word deceiver, and the behavior is wrapped around deceit. Interesting, because part of it is his, another part of it is attached to his mom, and another part is to his future father-in-law. Very interesting, but the deceiver part, that gets stuck to Jacob. So Jacob is living up to his name, or is Jacob living and we're looking back and we're saying, Jacob? Which Jacob? Oh, the deceiver Jacob. Something to ponder. I mean, I love the Jacob story because in his life, we kind of see something that we say often in our time here today, right? We use the phrase, what goes around comes around. Because I'm talking about people that would say, if you do that, it's going to come back to haunt you. And I think we see this very, very much in the Jacob story. Read it. Again, it's quite striking. The fact that he had 4 wives, well, okay, 2 wives, 2 maidservants who bore him children, really only loved one of them. It's fair to say Jacob, he's a hot mess. And then, like I mentioned before, about mentioning things that are part of their behavior, that when the children of Israel are listening to this, and they're hearing the story told to them, and these are the people that are post-Sinai. Remember, yeah, they're post-Sinai, and they're being told this story, looking backwards, so they already know what the instruction is with this, and they're hearing the story, and they go, oh, that's why we shouldn't or don't do this. It's interesting today, maybe we have something similar, a warning label on something that says, don't do this. And then we realize it's because somebody has already done it. So now that's why we get that warning against it. So I get those warnings and the instructions, written warnings and instructions. Sometimes I'd say warnings are a precursor to instructions. That makes sense? That we have warnings, and you'll hear these in the story. I mean, that red light will go off. It's almost like the story becomes the warning. And then, when we get the instruction afterwards, then we see it. It's more to ponder when we look at the stories. You know, I think sometimes we don't take the time to look at these stories, especially Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think they're great ways to look at it and say, yeah, now I see why we don't do this and why Torah addresses it. It's also interesting because we think that we've been told that Torah's no longer, a valid piece of wisdom. And I'm not sure I agree with that. And a lot of it is because of this actual behavior. And we're seeing it. And we want to make sure that we don't do it. You know, I really do wish that we had updated Torah versions from God for us in our day, right? Today. Because I wonder what it would look like. So next, we're going to continue with more of the lives of these sons and the mass after them, and this continued promise with God. And should it, look any different? And remember, we have a mirror looking back at our own behavior. So we have more of the promises slowly unfold. This will continue to be fun and, as you can tell, challenging. So, thanks for with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class, the TaNaK, the Old Testament, on the Dusty Feet.